Okay, let's talk about completing the square a little bit more. Now, previously, we completed the square on some fairly basic problems. There's a couple other things, though, that we need to talk about when we complete the square. First things first, we can really only complete the square for now when the number in front is a 1, okay? Additionally, we really only want to complete the square when the number in front of the x variable is even, okay? So we don't want to really do much completing the square if those two things aren't true. Reason being is if I have completing the square, the general pattern is I take whatever is in the middle term, 28x. I'm going to cut this thing in half. And then I'm going to multiply to put it here. So 14 times 14. 196, okay? And that breaks into x plus 14, x plus 14. If that number in the middle is not even, let's say we have x squared minus or plus 7x plus blank, well, unfortunately, nothing breaks it in half very nicely. 3.5x and 3.5x. And then so I have this, I got x, and I got plus and 3.5 and 3.5, but 3.5 times 3.5 is going to be ugly. And that gives me 12.25. And of course, that's all decimals. We don't like that. Really, we ought to be doing this as fractions. So we would say, well, that's x and x. Plus and plus, and so cut it in half is 7 halves and 7 halves. So we have 7 halves and 7 halves, and that's really 49 fourths. And so breaking it in that sense gets really ugly. At that point, you might as well have gone back and done the quadratic formula. So the other thing we need to talk about is if the middle term is negative, minus 4x. Everything's been totally positive here thus far. But if it's minus 4x, it's not really a big deal. As long as we have a 1 up front and an even in front of the x, it's not a real big deal. It's still x, and you still break it down, but now it's negative 2, and negative 2 would make negative 4. But when you multiply them together, negative times a negative is a positive, so minus 2, nothing that terribly challenging there, but because you're always going to multiply them, the end term is going to come out positive. Now, it is possible to complete the square when you have a non-1 number. We don't really love that. I suppose if you get the 4x up front and you get a 6x here plus blank, the first thing you're going to want to do is get rid of the 4. So we divide by 4, and so that gives us x squared plus 6 fourths x plus blank. Well, what is 6 fourths? Well, that's 3 fourths x and 3 fourths x. And you see how completing the square, if you don't have the required conditions, really is probably not going to be your best option, because when you multiply, you get 9/16. And if this were equal to, say, I don't know, 5, here it's equal to 5, I'd still have to add 9/16 to this side, which is doable, but it's going to be nasty. Okay, so we take 5 times 16. You come up with 80 over 16 plus 9 over 16. You get 89 over 16. X plus 3 fourths, the quantity squared, equals 89 over 16. And then, of course, you square root both sides. And, now you have a square root of 89/16. So you have x plus 3 fourths equals plus or minus the square root of 89 over, now square root of 16 is 4, and then you subtract 3 fourths minus 3 fourths. At this point, you should have done the quadratic formula and made it easy on yourself. So it's more completing the square. You can do it in other things, but the conditions really are a leading coefficient of 1, middle term needs to be even, and then you can use them from there. If you have a coefficient that isn't 1, you could try dividing and see how that works, but it may turn out to be a little bit messy.